Currency paper is more durable and is actually made up of 75% cotton, 75% cotton, 75% cotton, and 25% linen.
Pick that cotton. Move along now. Come on, Evan. Drive them there. Pick that cotton. Move along now. Here, what you doing?
Oh, work this cotton.
Work this cotton.
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 Oh, work this cotton.
You've been picking cotton all your life?
Yes, sir, all my life.
What's the most pounds you ever picked in a day?
500 pounds?
By yourself?
Yes, sir.
How much did you get per pound? What did they pay per pound for that?
Well, he was cheap then.
How much?
I just remember now, but he didn't want nothing.
50 cents a day, $1 a day?
Well, something like that, I reckon. That's like stuff high now. You can't hardly make it now. Goes out, gets a little old check, and it don't hardly take care of my expenses. Time I buy my food, pay my house rent, and insurance, light bill, and buy my food, and buy my clothes. It don't leave me over $2, $3.
And maybe at the heart of it all, capitalism is the problem.
It was all a scheme. Dreams. Check your reality. Everything's for sale in the land of free opportunity. Money wastes the poor, creating scores of this poverty. And we all pay the cost cause we lost all humanity. Choose.
At that time, cotton was a difficult crop for planters because removing the seeds was a grueling and exhausting process involving many slaves. Long staple cotton was the easiest to pick and remove seeds. Still, it took slaves 10 hours to remove the seeds from 1 pound of cotton lint.
Great God Almighty, gonna pick a bale of cotton. Great God Almighty, gonna pick a bale of day. Great God Almighty, gonna pick a bale of cotton. Great God Almighty, gonna pick a bale of day. Oh Lord, pick a bale of cotton. Oh Lord, pick a bale of day. Oh Lord, pick a bale of cotton. Oh Lord, pick a bale of day.
In 1793, while tutoring on a Georgia plantation, a man named Eli Whitney created an invention which he believed would make cleaning cotton easier and would lessen the need for slaves. That invention, the cotton engine, or cotton gin for short, was a mechanical device that separated cotton fibers from cotton seeds and dramatically lowered the cost of producing cotton fiber. According to Whitney,
this gin, if turned with horses or by water, 2 persons will clean as much cotton in 1 day as 100 persons could clean in the same time.
However, what actually happened as a result of this invention could not have been predicted. In England, the Industrial Revolution sparked a number of inventions in the textile industry, which enabled textiles to be mass-produced and made Britain's need for cotton so insatiable that cotton became vital to the American economy. The gin's effect on the economy and on the lives of the slaves who made up a significant part of that economy was complex. While it was true that the cotton gin freed slaves from the arduous labor of separating seeds from the lint by hand, this increased demand for cotton also increased the demand for slaves needed to grow it and harvest the fields.
Oh, when them cotton bolls get rotten, you couldn't pick very much cotton in them old cotton fields at home. It was down in Louisiana, just a mile from Texarkana, and them old cotton fields at home.
At the turn of the century, American cotton production was at 75,000 bales. However, by mid-century, America was growing 75% of the world's supply of cotton, about 4 million bales. This boom in production directly related to an increased demand for slaves. The number of slaves in America increased from 750,000 in 1790 to well over 4 million by 1860. By then, approximately 1 in 3 Southerners was a slave. Cotton plantations were a miserable life for slaves.
Currency paper is more durable and is actually made up of 75% cotton and 25% linen.
Most paper is made from wood. Crane & Company's currency stock is made from cotton and linen. The 8-step process begins with 6,000 pounds of cotton. It's loaded into a giant boiler and pressure cooked for 2 hours.
Now our currency business is our biggest business by far. It's not only paper making, but it's a very technical, consisting of films and fibers and threads and watermarks and other things. And so technology has kept us on the forefront of being able to compete in that market. The currency business was quite strong through the recession. Central banks still have to issue banknotes. We have invested quite heavily over the years in the technology, high-quality banknotes to the world market. One of the interesting statistics is during the economic recession, there was some flight away from credit card purchases and more in cash. And so the use and velocity of cash, even in this country, I think increased over the past couple of years. Where Crane sees the potential growth is in the international arena. And we are providing banknotes to some of the cash-based economies in the world.
More than 90% of the notes that the Bureau delivers each year are used to replace money that's already in or has been taken out of circulation. And according to moneyfactory.com, approximately 8.4 billion notes were printed in 2012. That includes every denomination and totals over $358 billion. So
we are asking about how much cash there is on the entire planet. Well, that amount has a special name. It is called M0. It's an aggregate of all coins and banknotes. DollarDays.org's most recent estimate values this total amount, considering all currencies and countries, at just slightly over the equivalent of 5 trillion US dollars. That number, the value of all of the currency on Earth, M0, is huge. But believe it or not, it represents less than 10% of all of the money we humans have available to spend right away.
Hey, buddy, you gonna pay for that or what?
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the set. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise.
Cost to produce each one of those bills? The answer is 8.7 cents.
So the exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And, of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion, to 6.5 billion, to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters? Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system,
Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
A logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money, when we create money out of thin air. We have no savings, yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary. For the act of expanding the money supply without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy will always debase a currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence. Now, if this reality of inherent and perpetual inflation seems absurd and economically self-defeating, hold that thought, for absurdity is an understatement in regard to how our financial system really operates. For in our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation. Now, so far we have discussed the reality that money is created out of debt, through loans. These loans are based on a bank's reserves, and reserves are derived from deposits. And through this fractional reserve system, any one deposit can create 9 times its original value, in turn debasing the existing money supply, raising prices in society. And since all this money is created out of debt and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists, where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pool enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living. As dysfunctional and backwards as all of this might seem, there is still one thing we have omitted from this equation. And it is this element of the structure which reveals the truly fraudulent nature of the system itself: the application of interest. When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, only what would be referred to as the principal is being created in the money supply. So then, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. The ramifications of this are staggering, for the amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers true wealth from the individual to the banks. For if you are unable to pay for your mortgage, they will take your property. This is particularly enraging when you realize that not only is such a default inevitable due to the fractional reserve practice, but also because of the fact that the money that the bank loaned to you didn't even legally exist in the first place. For every time you borrow money from a bank, whether it is a mortgage loan or a credit card charge, the money given to you is not only counterfeit, it is an illegitimate form of consideration, and hence voids the contract to repay, for the bank never had the money as property to begin with. Unfortunately, such legal realizations are suppressed and ignored, and the game of perpetual wealth transfer and perpetual debt continues. And this brings us to the ultimate question: why? During the American Civil War, President Lincoln bypassed the high-interest loans offered by the European banks and decided to do what the Founding Fathers advocated, which was to create an independent and inherently debt-free currency. It was called the greenback. Shortly after this measure was taken, an internal document circulated between private British and American banking interests stated, "Slavery is but the owning of labor and carries with it the care of laborers, while the European plan is that capital shall control labor by controlling wages. This can be done by controlling the money. It will not do to allow the greenback, as we cannot control that."
What is the matrix? Control.
To the great majority of banks in the world, is, in fact, a system of modern slavery. Think about it. Money is created out of debt. And what do people do when they are in debt? They submit to employment to pay it off. But if money can only be created out of loans, how can society ever be debt-free? It can't. And that's the point.
As long as the matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
And it is the fear of losing assets coupled with the struggle to keep up with the perpetual debt and inflation inherent in the system, compounded by the inescapable scarcity within the money supply itself, created by the interest that can never be repaid, that keeps the wage slave in line, running on the hamster wheel with millions of others, in effect powering an empire that truly benefits only the elite at the top of the pyramid. For, at the end of the day, who are you really working for? The banks. Money is created in a bank and invariably ends up in a bank. They are the true masters, along with the corporations and governments they support. Physical slavery requires people to be housed and fed. Economic slavery requires people to feed and house themselves. It is one of the most ingenious scams for social manipulation ever created, and at its core, it is an invisible war against the population. Debt is the weapon used to conquer and enslave societies, and interest is its prime ammunition. And as the majority walks around oblivious to this reality, the banks, in collusion with governments and corporations, continue to perfect and expand their tactics of economic warfare, spawning new bases, such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund.
Their mouths are full of bitterness and curses, and in their paths, nothing but ruin and misery, and the fear of God is not before their eyes. They have taken the hearts and minds of our leaders. They have recruited the rich and the powerful, and they have blinded us to the truth. And our human spirit is corrupted. Why do we worship greed? Because outside the limit of our sight, feeding off us, perched on top of us from birth to death, are our owners. Our owners. They have us. They control us. They are our masters. Wake up. They're all about you, all around you.
The Matrix. Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
And maybe at the heart of it all, capitalism is the problem.
It was all a scheme. Dreams. Check your reality. Everything's for sale in the land of free opportunity. Money wastes the poor, creating scores of this poverty. And we all pay the cost cause we lost all humanity. Choose